Recording. All right. Hello, everyone. This is the cloud provider extraction migration biweekly Subproject meeting. Let me share my screen. All right. So let's go ahead with the agenda. First thing I wanted to bring up was the prototype PR that I opened yesterday. So we agreed in the last meeting that it's been kind of hard to move forward with the CCM migration stuff, only because we're talking a lot about it in the abstract, and we don't really have concrete details to go over and talk it through. So I pretty much put together this PR, which isn't final by any means, but I think it has enough implementation details for us to at least come to an agreement on the design, and then update the KEP and get approval on the KEP. Let me start with the interface that I have defined here.
Could you control plus this? It's a little small.
Yes.
Thank you.
Let me find a form. What am I looking at? So where's that file? Yeah, there it is. So I created a package called migration and component base, and it pretty much has a type called migrated controllers. And in this type, you specify a unique name, the list of controllers that you are migrating, the component name, which contains like the binary name of the controller manager you're running in. And then it has leader election configs. And so it has a helper method to say, you pass in a controller name, and it can tell you if this migrating controller owns that controller. And then lastly, it has a run function, which is pretty much like copied. It's copied straight from what's already in the Kube controller manager and the cloud controller manager. So it just does like all the client go leader election stuff. And all you need to pass it is a run function. And so going to the implementation, I added in the cloud provider interface, what I added was a migration config method to the main interface. And so cloud provider implements this method, and then it returns a list of migrating controllers, which is the struct that we just looked at. And then pretty much both the cloud controller manager and the Kube controller manager, we'll start with the cloud controller manager. It calls that method from the cloud provider here, right? And then if it's enabled, it goes through each migration config. It checks the existing list of controllers, and then it asks if it goes through all the controllers. If it sees that the migrating controller type owns that controller, and if the component name matches the current component name, it then appends it to a list of migrating controllers. And then later it removes that controller from the primary list of controllers. And then here, someone asking something? Yeah, so here it runs the main controllers from the primary controllers list. And then if it sees that the migration is enabled, it goes through each config again, and then it'll start. So what happens is, for every migration controller that the provider specifies, it runs a Go routine that runs just those controllers in a separate leader election loop or whatever. And then, are you guys following so far? I feel like I'm kind of just, is it making sense, or is there something that's not clear yet?
Yeah, some comments for me is I like to make the type be named like migration config instead of migration controllers, because when you're using the variables, you're using migration configs. And also, I'd prefer to have a struct instead of a list of migrating controllers to the interface. So maybe we need to add in more fields, but make it an array. It's hard to add in new fields to the interface if we need something. More sense than just a list of migration config.
Okay, good to know. So yeah, I don't think the types or the interface names or anything is final. Very open to, like, I literally just slapped this together yesterday. I'm open to changing those. I think like what I want consensus on is like the general approach of like where we're allowing the migration config to be specified, and then where we're calling it and how we're wiring it together to form, like how we're doing the leader election from each of the binaries. So let me go to the section where the cloud provider specifies what the migration config looks like. So for AWS, you would just specify, this is just one way to do it, but you can specify a variable here that says, this particular one is all controllers. So we put in the list of all controllers we know are the cloud specific ones. We may want to have a constant or something for this, so you don't accidentally put in the wrong controller name, but this is the rough idea. And then you'd say, I want this controller to run in Cloud Controller Manager. So this is assuming that in some previous release, you had this specified already. And then in 116, this might've been Kube Controller Manager. And then in 117, you're switching it to Kube Controller Manager, right? The GCE one or the Azure one here, Azure might want to just migrate only the network controllers in one release. And so you would do that. And then in another release, you would create a new variable that's, Azure migrating node controllers, and you do the same thing. For the GCE case, you might want to you can specify both together. So you might want one that's the network controllers, another that's just the node controllers. There should be node controllers, by the way. And so like allowing the provider to say like what versions a set of controllers should be migrating, and then what component they should be running on. That's pretty much the PR. I feel like the logic here is a little hard to follow. It's kind of a big blob of for loops and ifs. We can simplify this, but I feel like this is a good way. This is like the logic in its most simplest form of what we would be doing with this change. And so, yeah, questions, concerns, comments?
So I guess the one question I have is there a reason why we're not going, and if the answer is, hey, go ahead and implement it, show me, that's fine. But is there a reason we're not going with the YAML approach where we just encode this in a YAML file and we just read the YAML file at the beginning of the controller manager?
Yeah, no reason. Like in the Slack channel, I put in that I didn't do that just because it was hard to prototype it. But like pretty much like this call here can read that like a YAML file or whatever. I don't care too much how that's being read. I do care, but like I think either way works, as long as we are in agreement with this logic here and this logic here.
Yeah, and I guess my only thought is it'd be nice if we just did something that, I don't object to doing it with the cloud provider. I would just like to not lock us into the cloud provider. So I'd like there to be at least an abstraction.
Yeah, sorry, I'm muting and I'm muting you because there's echo there. I realized the other day that it actually might be problematic to do it with the cloud provider, and we may need to go the external YAML config route, because if you specify it with the cloud provider, you are essentially forcing a user to use a cloud controller manager on a specific release, which is a good thing for us, but for users, it might be really frustrating because there will be some release where we switch the component name of a migrating config, and then if they are not running the cloud controller manager on that release, then things would break.
I also think that when we go to actually finish extracting this, if you're late to doing the migration, you might actually have a KCM that doesn't have a cloud provider, and that'll be a problem.
Right. So like if we did this, like I think this is fine as long as there's a feature gate, right? And so if the feature gate's off, then you run all your controllers everywhere in the KCM. And then if your feature gate is on, you're assuming that the user understands that they need to run the cloud controller manager somewhere in the cluster.
But it's still, is there anything that like hard codes what, like, so would they still be able to just enable that feature gate in the next version? Is that how they would control it? If they want to take more time, for example, with their migration, do they just keep that feature gate disabled and then enable it whenever they want to?
No. So I think what would happen is, if we're going with this design, which is not final, right? But just as a thought exercise, if we went with this and then we added a feature gate, what it would mean is you as the implementer of the provider define like what version the migration happens, and the user is responsible for enabling the feature gate on that version switch.
So, but what happens if the user doesn't enable
Then
it?
they would just keep the feature flag off forever.
And what if they want to do it at a later date? Is that possible?
That's a good question. So like if we need to address that case, then I guess this design wouldn't work. Then in that case, we may need to go the route what Walter suggested, which is you read in the migration config from an external YAML file, and that would define how the migration happens.
Yeah, like I didn't think about this until you just brought it up, but I can't imagine that asking everybody to turn on a feature flag at a specific release is not gonna work, right?
Yeah, that's a good point. So like one thing that might have to happen is we'd have the feature flag, but then the migrating controller goes across multiple versions. So we give like a time window, like 1.17 to 20 is your migrating window, and we'll support this config with the feature gate for those releases. And if you haven't migrated, then but I don't know if that's reasonable either.
Yeah.
So Walter, how do you feel about maybe, so if we can agree on if we can agree on the mechanism, then we can then maybe like what I can do is I can update prototype to use Walter's commit instead of reading it directly from the provider.
Yeah, I think that's my biggest objection. And in fact, if we put in one layer of indirection, I don't even care if we do pull it from, as long as it's not obvious where you have it here, which is in the controller manager. If the controller manager is sort of given, so instead of it pulling, if someone pushes that to here, then I don't care if it's coming from a file or coming from the cloud provider. And then it's not that you don't have to make a cloud call, because it's fine here in the cloud controller manager, but we have to do exactly the same thing in the cube controller manager. And that's where I start worrying.
Yeah. My concern is like, if we tell users, hey, you need to turn on this flag, and you need to, here's a config you have to make by hand, and then you have to pass that into these components, like no one's going to do it. That's my concern. So I'm trying to get to a place where like we're forcing users, like you have to do it in this time window, and it's going to be turned on automatically. And if you don't do it, that's your fault. Like I want to get to that place, but then I don't want the thing that they have to do to be too hard that we kind of put them in a, like we should leave enough time for them to do it, but doing it should be easy and maybe automatic.
I think that's fair. My thought was that if we provide them with the default YAML file, and for the cloud providers are just going to produce their own when they want to do the migration. And then if we just produce a YAML file and make it part of the standard images that we know of and, you know, push out the message, hey, you need to do it, then it's really no different than doing it through the cloud provider interface, right? I mean, it's the same people who have to do the work, except that instead of me having to do the work in my implementation of the cloud provider interface, I can give you the default YAML and you only have to change that if you don't like it.
Okay. Sorry, what do you mean by giving them the default YAML? Like you mean just documenting a default YAML and assuming users will use that?
So, I mean, we should talk about what the customer case is.
Yeah.
But I mean, I'm thinking like for GCE, not GKE, GCE, I can just, I mean, and granted that's because it's in tree and I get all of that, but I can provide and check in a YAML file, and in fact, we can, if no one objects, I'll check in a YAML file, indicates Kate's at the top level, and we can then just deploy that in the cube up or whichever the deployment system is, and set the flag by default in the set of flags for the controller manager. And then, yeah, for people who are rolling their own deployment scripts like Rancher or whoever, we provide them with, hey, here's the suggested YAML file. You can just pick it up and use it, or you can override it. And I think that's a level of work they would have to do even with the solution you have here, because they're going to have to put those code changes into their cloud provider implementation.
Okay. Yeah, I don't like overall I don't object to that. But I think if we can find a more streamlined way to do it, we should consider it. But if we're saying like there's no other way and the user has to pass in a config, like, I'm okay with that.
I think there is a more streamlined way, and this is the other one I think Nick and I had discussed in one of the cloud provider extraction meetings, which was if we don't do this in the cloud provider interface, we provide a migration interface. And I don't care if the cloud provider implementation implements the migration interface, but we keep it as a separate interface. We could, in fact, say that there is a default migration implementation, and anything you do is overriding the default migration implementation. And the default migration implementation, let's say, just says, you will be migrating these 3 controllers from the KCM to the CCM across the 120 to 121 release.
But how is that different from the problem that Nick was just talking about, where like we're now forcing users on one specific release to do a migration? Sorry, I muted you because there's like
providing the default behavior to do the migration here, and you can provide if the file isn't the way you want to do it, you can either use the override that says I want to pick it up from file, or you can implement your own migration implementation that says where you want it and how you want to do it.
Right. So I think my concern there is that, sorry, I'm going to mute you.
We're discussing 2 things right now. So there's the one, which is the user story and how a user actually goes through this upgrade. And then the other one is the actual interface and code that each cloud provider has to implement, or, you know, if it's something separate. And I think we need to figure out what we're okay with in the user story before we can be certain about what we're okay with in the actual interface and the code. Because if we're okay with users, you know, forcing users to upgrade over one version, which I have doubts about, that might have effects. and what we can do in the code. But if it's going to have to be a longer window, if there's, I don't know. Does that make sense, or am I?
Yeah, no, it makes sense to me. I mean, my thought is I'm hearing two things, and I'm trying to find the comfortable in between. I think there is this story of the right thing should happen if I do nothing, and that's for me where defaults fall in. And I don't want to force people to a particular release. And again, I think that's where I'm hoping that's where the default, where you can say, look, if you do absolutely nothing, yes, you're going to get migrated from this release to this release. But there is a well-defined, fairly easy mechanism for you to determine where and what you're going to migrate, right? And so it's more difficult than the do nothing option because you're not doing nothing. But it's sort of, I'm hoping it provides that nice where, the standard behavior is easy or free, and the exceptionals all work and aren't too difficult.
So here's what I think is going to happen if we do that. We're gonna reach that version where if users didn't do anything, they're gonna get migrated. They're gonna get migrated without the CCM, and everything's gonna break. And then they're gonna look up docs for that, and then they're gonna find, oh, do this thing to disable the migration, and everyone's gonna disable the migration, and then we're stuck in a situation where everyone has disabled migration, everyone is still in tree, and then we're now trying to get people onto the CCM.
So I think the first thing is just because we allow them to delay. So the first thing is that we should have a very hard, like in 122, this code is going away. In 120 to 121, we're going to migrate you from KCM to CCM, and that's what should happen. And by the way, you can delay, but if you try and delay past 122, it's not going to work, and there's no amount of not migrating which is going to fix the fact that you're not running a CCM, and the relevant controllers no longer work in the KCM because they're not even built into the KCM.
Yeah, I'm okay with that. What about other folks?
You have to say, Nick, Craig?
I have to say, unfortunately, I haven't thought through all of these cases enough, and I am distracted with a customer issue.
Yeah, no worries.
I don't have an opinion at this moment.
We can summarize it in the channel as well after, because I have another meeting in a minute that I need to go to. But sorry, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, so I'm wondering, like this default do nothing case. So are we gonna, like you're talking about, I can see us having a default do nothing case where we migrate the controllers out of the KCM, and then are we going to have some way of users selecting, like are we going to build into these default configs what cloud provider they, like if all they have to do is say, I want to do the do nothing case for AWS, and I get some default, and it's going to pick the binary or the version of the cloud provider that we've chosen for that version, or like what does this default case look like?
So my thought is we could even have layered defaults. So my thought is the base level default is the default that would be picked for something where the cloud provider has done nothing to help you, right? And so we just pick a release saying 120 to 121, we're going to move you across, and hopefully that all works. Now, it is possible, and that's the base default. It is also then possible, if you look at the way the cloud providers inject themselves, to have the cloud provider come in and say, I would like to, even if it's not your, what's AKS or EKS, you can say, like, just for the default open source Amazon whatever, when the Amazon cloud provider init runs, it'll inject a separate default which will provide Amazon-specific defaults. And then, on top of that, you could always then say, by the way, here's the YAML file with my migration plan, and that overrides that either the first or second layer default.
Okay, so I guess the different users that I'm thinking about. So there's like the user that did everything by hand, and maybe used kubeadm or whatever. They have a lot of control over their cluster. Then there's like the for AWS we have like COPS users who are using some kind of a provisioning system that's not EKS, and then there's EKS. And so I see like COPS and EKS, both the framework provides the config and chooses the version, and all the user does is say, I want to upgrade to this version, and then the framework does the work and picks the version of the cloud provider, CCM that is going to run and creates the migration config or whatever. But for the user that's doing everything themselves, I'm just wondering, like, what are all the things that they have to do? So in this case, they would just create a override migration config that says, or is there a default that they can use on a specific software?
So my hope, and obviously things have to be done to make this work, is that let's say it's 120 to 121, someone has gone in and made the CCM the default in 121. We know that. And so we provide a default migration that says, okay, CCM is now the default in 121. And if you upgrade from 120 to 121, the migration locks in 120 say KCM should get a migration lock. In 121, CCM should grab the migration lock, and KCM shouldn't run those, and from there, the right thing should happen.
Yeah, so if you don't configure your own CCM, then you're just going to lose those controllers, or because they're not going to run in the KCM after the next version, right?
Presumably not. Although we could have that partly configured by this migration lock, but even there, I mean, as I said, at some point, whether it's 122 or 123, those controllers won't even be built into the KCM anymore.
Right.
Now, the other thing is, at some point, probably that same release, the cloud provider isn't going to be built into the KCM anymore.
Mm-hmm. Okay. All right. I think I have to run to another meeting as well.
Well, I think the good news is we've got a Slack channel for this, and we've got a PR. And I think those are both good places to really capture a lot of this conversation.
Agreed.
And the goal is to get something into the CAP. So we've got a couple of months to really iron out all the details. So I don't think any of this is pressing.
Cool. All righty. Well, I'll talk to you in the Slack channel then.
Talk to you in the Slack channel. And you also for you, are you going to KubeCon?
Yes, I will be.
Awesome. So how does Thursday night work for a dinner for you?
Let me double check my schedule, and can we on Slack?
Okay, sounds good.
Alrighty. Bye.